With trembling hands and the weight of 30 years of marriage on her shoulders, Sarah Miller stood on the porch of her family farm as county officials delivered the foreclosure notice, never suspecting that hidden in her late husband's workshop lay documents that would expose a decades-old corruption scheme and save not just her home, but the entire valley. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind scattered golden leaves across the weathered driveway as Sarah Miller watched the county car disappear down the dirt road, her heart sinking with each passing second. The foreclosure notice trembled in her weathered hands, its official letterhead and cold legal language threatening to end everything she'd spent her life building. Pine Creek Farm stretched out before her, 120 acres of rolling hillsides and fertile bottomland that had been in her husband Jim's family for 4 generations. The land had supported the Millers through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the farming crisis of the 1980s, and countless personal hardships. The old oak trees lining the eastern field had witnessed marriages, births, deaths, and now might witness her forced departure. 6 months earlier, Sarah had stood in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church as they lowered Jim's casket into the ground. At 62, she'd expected to grow old with her husband, not to face her golden years alone. Jim had passed suddenly, a heart attack while working in the barn on an otherwise normal Tuesday morning. The neighbors had rallied around her, bringing casseroles and offering help with the spring planting. But as the seasons changed, life had returned to normal for everyone except Sarah. Each morning she woke in an empty bed, made coffee for one, and faced the endless tasks of maintaining a family farm without a partner of 30 years. And now this, a tax bill for $157,892 in supposedly unpaid property taxes dating back 15 years. An impossible sum for a widow living on modest farm income and the small teacher's pension from her years at the elementary school. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, followed by increasingly aggressive visits from county officials, culminating in today's formal foreclosure notice. 30 days to vacate the only real home she had ever known. Sarah stared at the foreclosure notice, trying to make sense of it. Fighting County Hall had never been part of her life plan. For 3 decades, she had defined herself through supporting Jim's farming dreams, raising their 2 children in the farmhouse where his great-grandparents had settled, and keeping meticulous financial records for their modest but sustainable operation. The children were grown now, Michael an accountant in Chicago with 2 kids of his own, and Emily a veterinarian in Denver. They had both offered to help her sell the farm after Jim's death, seeing the endless work it required, but Sarah had refused. This land was more than property. It was the physical embodiment of their family's history. We've reviewed property records and discovered significant tax liabilities dating back 15 years. The initial letter had stated with bureaucratic coldness. Payment in full is required within 30 days or foreclosure proceedings will commence. In the astronomical sum, $157,892, had initially seemed like an obvious mistake. Jim had been religious about their taxes, having once told her that a farmer who doesn't pay attention to his paperwork loses his land as surely as one who doesn't watch the weather. Her first reaction had been to gather their immaculate financial records and visit the county assessor's office, certain the mistake would be quickly rectified. Instead, she had found herself sitting across from Robert Wilson, the newly elected county commissioner whose campaign had promised to bring prosperity and development to our underutilized rural areas. His tailored suit and silk tie had seemed jarringly out of place among the scuffed government furniture and flickering fluorescent lights. "Records show what they show, Mrs. Miller," Wilson had said, barely glancing at the tax receipts and bank statements she had carefully organized in her folder. His manicured hands had remained folded on top of her file, never opening it. Greenfield County is modernizing its approach to delinquent properties. The valley needs development, not struggling family farms. However, he had added with a smile that never reached his eyes, I'd be happy to discuss alternatives to foreclosure, perhaps selling a portion of your land to offset the tax burden. Now back in the kitchen, where she had prepared thousands of family meals, hosted holiday gatherings, and sat up with Jim planning each season's crops, Sarah spread the foreclosure papers across the worn oak table her grandfather-in-law had built. As a wedding gift, the polished surface still bore faint rings from hot coffee cups and barely visible scratches from homework assignments and board games. 30 days to vacate, to pack up 30 years of memories and leave behind the rooms where her children had taken their first steps, the garden where 4 generations of Miller women had grown vegetables, the porch swing where she and Jim had watched countless sunsets. The rational choice would be to call Michael and Emily, explain the situation, start packing, and look for a small apartment in town near her sister. At 62, managing 120 acres alone was already a daily challenge. That would only become more difficult with each passing year. Yet something kept her from reaching for the phone. Perhaps the memory of Jim's absolute certainty whenever anyone had suggested selling even small parcels of the property. "This farm stays intact," he would say with uncharacteristic firmness. A steely resolve, replacing his usual easygoing demeanor. Some things are worth more than money. There had been offers over the years, especially for the northwestern ridge that overlooked the valley. Developers had envisioned vacation homes with panoramic views. A renewable energy company had wanted the site for a small wind farm. Jim had turned them all away, sometimes after brief consideration, sometimes without even discussing the details. Sarah had never fully understood his attachment to that particular section. Rocky soil made it unsuitable for crops, and the steep grade presented challenges for grazing. But something in his expression whenever that land was mentioned had stopped her from questioning his decisions. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the fields, Sarah found herself drawn to Jim's workshop behind the barn. Her footsteps on the gravel path echoed in the stillness, each crunch seeming to emphasize her solitude. She had avoided this space since the funeral, initially because the pain of seeing his unfinished projects was too raw, and later from a vague sense that entering his private domain would somehow make his absence more permanent. Unlike the methodically organized toolshed where he kept his farming equipment in military precision, this small, wood-paneled room had been Jim's personal sanctuary, a space Sarah had always respected as entirely his own. The workshop stood, apart from the other outbuildings, nestled between 2 ancient elm trees that Jim had refused to cut down, even when disease threatened them. "Those trees have earned their right to stand," he'd said, treating them instead with a homemade remedy, passed down through generations of Millers. The door creaked on its hinges as Sarah pushed it open, releasing the distinctive blend of scents that defined Jim's presence. Linseed oil, coffee, the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco he'd occasionally indulge in despite her gentle scolding. About his health and the earthy smell of wood shavings. Dust motes danced in the last rays of sunlight streaming through the western window, highlighting the organized chaos that had been Jim's creative process. Everything remained exactly as he had left it that Tuesday morning. His favorite red and black flannel shirt still hanging on the brass hook by the door, a half-finished coffee cup on the workbench with a film of mold now covering the surface. His reading glasses perched atop a stack of farming magazines and equipment catalogs. An unfinished birdhouse, intended as a Christmas gift for their granddaughter, sat in the center of the main workspace, sandpaper and wood glue still laid out in preparation for the next step that never came. Sarah moved slowly through the space, running her fingers along the edge of his workbench, touching the handles of tools that had shaped countless projects over the decades. Unlike the stark grief of the funeral, where Jim's absence had been a gaping wound, Here she felt a different sensation, as if the room still held his essence, preserved in the projects he had planned and the systems only he understood. She wasn't sure what had drawn her here today of all days, but as she settled onto his worn leather stool, some instinct guided her to the desk in the corner where Jim had handled the business side of their operation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The surface was cluttered with invoices for tractor parts, seed catalogs for the coming season, and sketches for farm improvements he would never implement. As she sorted through the papers, moving aside brochures for irrigation systems and organic fertilizers, Sarah's hand closed around something unexpected, an old leather-bound ledger wedged between equipment catalogs and pushed toward the back of the desk as if intentionally hidden. The book was worn at the edges, its leather cover softened by years of handling, its pages yellowed with age and slightly warped from humidity. Opening it, Sarah immediately recognized Jim's distinctive handwriting, neat, precise lettering that reflected his methodical approach to life, the same careful script from the birthday cards he had written her each year of their marriage, always including at least one line of poetry he'd selected especially for her. But this wasn't a collection of romantic verses. The ledger contained property records dating back 70 years, with detailed notes about boundary adjustments, water rights agreements with neighboring farms, and mineral surveys conducted throughout the valley. Jim had apparently been researching not just the history of their own land, but that of the entire region, creating intricate timelines of ownership changes and development proposals dating back to when his grandfather had first purchased the original 40 acres. Sarah flipped forward, looking for anything related to taxes or the county that might explain the sudden claim against their property. The entries became more frequent and increasingly detailed over the past 2 years, focusing particularly on land transactions throughout Greenfield Valley. There was an unexplained gap, several months with no entries, and then a single page with just one line written 2 weeks before his heart attack. Wilson knows what's there. All of them do. Wilson, the same county commissioner now pushing for foreclosure? The coincidence sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the evening air seeping through the workshop's old windows. She turned back several pages, now reading more carefully, finding increasingly disturbed notes about surveyor flags appearing along the northwestern ridge, unusual vehicles parked along their property line late in the evenings, and references to public records being adjusted at the county offices. This documentation reflected a side of Jim she had never seen, suspicious, investigative, almost paranoid in his attention to details that had seemed insignificant during their evening conversations. As she closed the ledger, processing this unexpected glimpse into Jim's concerns, her elbow knocked against a framed family photo that had sat on his workbench for years, the 4 of them at Emily's college graduation, smiling into the camera, with the untroubled happiness of a day that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. The frame toppled and fell, striking the small cast-iron wood stove that heated the workshop during winter months. Bending to retrieve the photograph, checking that the glass hadn't cracked, Sarah noticed something unusual about the flooring in that corner. While most of the workshop had original wide plank oak flooring, weathered by decades of boot traffic and stained with countless spills of paint and varnish, one section of boards near the stove appeared different, the grain pattern inconsistent. With surrounding planks, the edges more precisely cut, the finish slightly newer, though artfully distressed to match. Heart suddenly quickening, Sarah ran her fingers along the edges of these boards, feeling a slight difference in height, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. Acting on instinct rather than conscious thought, she pressed firmly against. one end of a plank and felt a slight give. Applying more pressure, she watched in astonishment as the board pivoted upward on what appeared to be carefully concealed hinges, revealing a small hollow space beneath the floor. The hidden compartment contained a single item, an old metal lockbox, approximately the size of a thick hardcover book, its dark green surface coated with a thin layer of dust despite its protected location. Unlike the weathered flooring, this was relatively new, secured with a modern padlock that gleamed in the fading evening light. Sarah lifted the box from its hiding place, surprising herself with a nervous glance toward the windows, as if expecting to be observed. The container was heavier than its size suggested, solid and substantial in her hands. There was no identification on its surface, no indication of what it might contain, but its careful concealment beneath false flooring suggested significant importance. She searched the workshop for the key, checking obvious places. Desk drawers, the small cabinet where Jim kept important tool components, the coffee can of miscellaneous hardware on his workbench. Finding nothing, she began to think more like Jim, considering where he would hide something meant to be found only by someone who understood him. Her eyes settled on the small bookshelf in the corner where he kept reference manuals for equipment, woodworking guides, and a few novels for when rain kept him indoors. Among them was a spy thriller she had given him 2 Christmases ago, a book he had devoured in 3 days and then described as far-fetched but entertaining. Something about its placement, slightly out of alignment with the other volumes, caught her attention. When she pulled it from the shelf, the book felt lighter than it should, and a slight rattle confirmed her suspicion. Jim had hollowed out its pages, creating a hiding place that contained a small silver key. Outside, evening was settling over the farm in earnest now. The distant rumble of thunder announced an approaching storm, and a light rain began to patter against the metal roof of the workshop. Through the single window, Sarah could see darkness gathering under the heavy clouds, the familiar landscape of their property fading into shadowy outlines. Lightning briefly illuminated the scene in harsh white light, and in that instant, Sarah thought she saw movement near the line of spruce trees that bordered the drive. A figure that appeared and disappeared so quickly, she immediately doubted her perception. "Just the shadows playing tricks," she whispered to herself, though the nearest tree was a good 30 feet from the building, and something in her racing heart suggested otherwise. Sarah returned her attention to the lockbox, carefully inserting the key with hands that had developed a slight tremor. The lock turned with a solid, well-oiled click, suggesting Jim had accessed these contents regularly despite their hidden nature. Lifting the lid revealed a carefully organized collection. Several yellowed documents protected in clear plastic sleeves, a modern USB drive secured in a small protective case, and a sealed envelope with her name written on it in Jim's distinctive handwriting. Beneath these items lay what appeared to be the cornerstone of the collection, a faded property deed dated 1953, when Jim's grandfather had completed the final purchase that established Pine Creek Farm at its current boundaries. Attached to it was a surveyor's map of the original property lines, with detailed notations about landmarks and boundary markers, many of which no longer existed. Paperclipped to these historical documents was a handwritten note in Jim's hand, dated just 3 weeks before his death. The real boundaries never changed. The records did. This is the proof. A chill ran down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the autumn evening or the rain now drumming steadily on the workshop roof. The implications of what she was seeing gradually assembled themselves in her mind like puzzle pieces falling into place. The tax bill, Wilson's convenient offer to purchase only the northwestern section, the sudden appearance of survey flags along boundaries that had been established for generations. These weren't isolated incidents, but connected elements of something far more calculated, Whatever Jim had uncovered in his investigation, it wasn't the idle speculation of a bored farmer with too much time on his hands during the winter months. The meticulous research documented in his ledger, the elaborate hiding place beneath custom-built false flooring, the carefully preserved historical documents, these were the actions of a man who had discovered something of profound importance and had taken deliberate steps to protect that discovery. "What did you find that frightened you so much, Jim?" she whispered to the empty workshop, her voice nearly lost beneath the increasing rhythm of raindrops. The silence offered no answer, but the contents of the lockbox seemed to pulse with urgency, as if Jim's discoveries had been waiting for this moment to reveal themselves. With careful hands, Sarah returned everything to the box except the envelope with her name and the USB drive. The workshop no longer felt like a safe place for examining the materials, not with the strange movement she had glimpsed outside, not with the new understanding that Jim's concerns might have been tragically valid. She secured the false floor back into place, making sure it settled evenly with the surrounding boards, and slipped the key and letter into her pocket. The dash back to the farmhouse through intensifying rain left her breathless and soaked, but the lockbox remained protected beneath her jacket. Once inside, she double-checked that all doors were locked and curtains drawn before settling at the kitchen table, the heart of their home where 30 years of family decisions had been made. With hands that still trembled slightly, she opened the envelope addressed to her. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams chaotic and unsettling, property lines that shifted like snakes whenever she approached them, faceless men in suits measuring her home for demolition, Jim trying to tell her something important, but his voice drowned out by the mechanical roar of bulldozers. She woke repeatedly, each time checking that the lockbox remained secure in its new hiding place inside the hollow base of her grandmother's antique floor lamp. Morning arrived with watery sunlight filtering through rain-washed windows. The storm, having passed during the night, but leaving behind a sodden landscape that mirrored Sarah's emotional state. The kitchen, usually her favorite room with its warm eastern exposure and views of the orchard, felt different now, as if the familiar space had been subtly altered by what she had learned within its walls. After a quick breakfast of toast and coffee that she barely tasted, Sarah retrieved the documents and USB drive, spreading them across the oak table where she'd spent half the night reviewing their contents until exhaustion had finally forced her to bed. In daylight, with a slightly clearer mind, she methodically organized the materials, creating a timeline of events based on Jim's notes and the documented evidence. What had initially looked like random property records and unrelated survey reports now revealed themselves as components of something far more systematic and disturbing. Jim had discovered significant discrepancies between the original deeds from the 1950s and current county records, not just for their farm, but for 12 properties throughout Greenfield Valley. The differences were subtle enough to escape. Casual notice, a boundary adjustment of 20 yards here, a redefined property corner there, but when mapped collectively, they formed a pattern too consistent to be coincidental. Each change effectively expanded the mineral rights boundaries of what appeared to be a holding company called Greenfield Development Partners, an entity that hadn't existed until 3 years ago. More significantly, each altered record coincided with a change in county administration or personnel, suggesting a coordinated effort that had spanned multiple election cycles. According to Jim's notes, the manipulations had accelerated dramatically after Wilson's election to the county commission. Most disturbing were the satellite images Jim had saved to the USB drive, professionally annotated with GPS coordinates and timestamps. They showed what appeared to be exploratory drilling equipment on rural county land adjacent to these adjusted boundaries, equipment that, according to local ordinances, would require special permits if the land were privately owned. But the most damning evidence was in the northwest corner of their own property, where the images clearly showed an access road and drilling platform on land that, according to the original deeds and surveys, belonged to the Millers, but had been quietly excised from their property and county records within the past 18 months. Sarah studied a side-by-side comparison Jim had created, the original 1953 survey of their property, with clear boundaries marked by surveyor stakes and natural landmarks, contrasted with the current digital county records showing a subtle but significant adjustment to the northwestern boundary. The difference encompassed approximately 5 acres, precisely the parcel Wilson had been so eager to purchase separately from the foreclosure proceedings. As Sarah continued her examination, she found a manila folder containing what appeared to be Jim's most significant discovery, a copy of a geological survey conducted 3 years earlier by Eastern State University's Department of Earth Sciences. According to Jim's attached notes, this survey had never been made public, and he had obtained it only through a former college roommate who now worked in the department. The technical document contained dense scientific terminology and data, tables that meant little to Sarah, but Jim had highlighted key sections and added his own annotations for clarity. The survey indicated significant natural gas deposits throughout Greenfield Valley, with particularly rich reserves concentrated, precisely in the areas where property records had been adjusted in county files. The northwest ridge of their own farm, historically considered one of the least valuable sections of their property due to its rocky soil and steep grade, sat atop what the survey described as potentially the most accessible and concentrated natural gas formation in the eastern region. A separate page contained Jim's handwritten timeline of events following his discovery of the survey. He had initially approached county officials with innocent questions about surveyor flags that had appeared along their back property line, but had been stonewalled with bureaucratic explanations about routine infrastructure assessment. His notes detailed a particularly telling encounter 6 months before his death. April 18th asked Wilson directly about survey flags and why they don't align with our property markers. He claimed routine county work related to watershed management. When I showed him our original survey stakes don't match the flag's placement, he couldn't explain the discrepancy. After pushing further, his demeanor changed completely. Suddenly friendly, concerned about outdated boundary markers causing confusion. Offered to resolve the issue by purchasing the northwestern acres at 3x market value for county conservation efforts. When I declined, he mentioned tax reassessments were coming up. Implied connection? In the margins of this entry, Jim had added a note that now seemed ominously prophetic. Not about conservation. They found something under our land and think, I don't know, tax threats, pressure tactic. Sarah set down the papers, her hands trembling, not with fear now, but with a growing anger. If these records were accurate and Jim's methodical documentation left little room for doubt, someone had been systematically altering property boundaries throughout the valley, creating a patchwork of mineral rights that would allow natural gas extraction without proper permissions or payments to the actual landowners. The fraudulent tax bill suddenly made perfect sense. Unable to purchase the land directly, they had manufactured a fiscal crisis that would force her off the property through foreclosure, allowing the county to acquire it at auction. The valley's historical agricultural character, the family farms that had defined this community for generations, the carefully maintained balance between development and preservation, all of it was being sacrificed to underground resources that most residents didn't even know existed. And Jim, with his detailed records and historical knowledge of the region's property boundaries, had been the one person standing in the way who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. A sharp knock at the front door startled Sarah from her grim realizations. Through the lace curtains her mother-in-law had crocheted decades earlier, she could see Commissioner Wilson's black Cadillac SUV parked in her driveway, its polished surface gleaming incongruously against the mud-splattered farm equipment in the background. Beside it sat an official county sheriff's vehicle, its light bar thankfully dormant. Something in her, perhaps Jim's voice echoing in her memory, made her quickly gather the documents and USB drive, sweeping them into a kitchen drawer beneath. The dish towels before the second, more insistent knock could be answered. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders in the way Jim had always admired, standing tall against the weather, he'd called it, and moved to the entryway. "Mrs. Miller," Commissioner Wilson greeted her when she opened the door, his smile practiced and politically calibrated. Today, he wore a casual-seeming outfit that nonetheless probably cost more than 3 months of her grocery budget, a camel-colored sport coat over dark jeans and a blue button-down that matched his campaign signs. "I hope I'm not interrupting your morning. I've brought Sheriff Davis along to continue our conversation about the property situation." Sheriff Kevin Davis stood slightly behind Wilson, his weathered face a mask of professional neutrality, though his eyes betrayed discomfort. Sarah had known Kevin since he was a gangly deputy fresh out of the academy, had watched him grow into his role as the county's top law enforcement officer. She'd even made his wedding cake 15 years ago when he married Lisa from the hardware store. "Morning, Sarah," he mumbled, the informality acknowledging their history while his uniform maintained official distance. Sarah remained firmly in the doorway, one hand on the frame, neither retreating nor inviting them further. "The 30-day notice isn't up for another 27 days, Commissioner. I'm still gathering materials to challenge the assessment." Wilson's smile remained fixed, but a tightness appeared around his eyes. Of course. Legal timelines are important, but actually, I came by with what might be good news for you." He gestured toward the interior of the house. "May we come in? This could be the solution you're looking for." Sarah hesitated, weighing the risks of allowing them inside against the potential information she might gather from the conversation. Reluctantly, she stepped back, leading them to the kitchen, the heart of the home, where the morning sunlight still streamed through east-facing windows, casting warm patterns across the oak table that had witnessed 4 decades of family meals. Wilson didn't wait for an invitation before settling into the chair at the head of the table, Jim's chair, where he had presided over Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings, where he'd helped their children with homework, and later, their grandchildren, with puzzles. The casual appropriation of this symbolic space sent a quiet alarm through Sarah, a confirmation that the man possessed no meaningful reverence for what he encountered. Sheriff Davis took a seat near the door, his discomfort increasingly evident as he perched on the edge of the chair, refusing the coffee Sarah automatically offered. "Mrs. Miller," Wilson began, opening a leather portfolio embossed with the county seal, "I've been reviewing your situation, and I think we can reach an arrangement that benefits everyone." He extracted a document from the portfolio, sliding it across the worn wooden surface toward her. "The county is prepared to be generous, given your circumstances. We can offer immediate forgiveness of the entire tax debt in exchange for a simple adjustment to your deed." "What kind of adjustment?" Sarah asked, though after reading Jim's notes she already knew the answer. "Nothing that would impact your daily operations," Wilson assured her, his tone shifting to what Sarah recognized as his television interview voice, reasonable, measured, concerned. "Just the northwestern portion of your property, roughly 5 acres along the ridge. It's land you're not farming anyway, too rocky for crops and too steep for practical grazing. The exact 5 acres that, according to Jim's documents, contained the richest natural gas deposits in the region." "And why would the county want that particular piece of land?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice level, determined not to reveal what she now knew. Wilson waved dismissively, his gold watch catching the sunlight. Future infrastructure planning, water management for the valley, technical matters that wouldn't interest you. He tapped the document with a manicured fingertip. This agreement releases you from all tax obligations in exchange for the adjustment. You keep your home, your farm operations continue unchanged. Everyone benefits. Sarah glanced at Sheriff Davis, who was studying the faded linoleum floor. With unusual intensity, his thumbs nervously rotating his wedding band. And if I want to verify these back taxes before signing anything, Jim kept meticulous records for 30 years. We never missed a payment. Something flashed in Wilson's eyes. Irritation, perhaps, or concern. The assessments are quite clear. Mrs. Miller, your husband. He hesitated, selecting his words carefully. May have been confused about certain obligations. These older properties sometimes have complicated tax structures that can be difficult for laypeople to fully understand. Jim was many things, Commissioner, but confused wasn't one of them, Sarah replied, her voice firmer now. He handled our finances and taxes for 3 decades without a single issue. He kept perfect records. Wilson's friendly demeanor cooled. Noticeably, the practiced smile diminishing by several watts. Records can be lost, Mrs. Miller, or misinterpreted. The county's documentation is what matters legally. He tapped the paper between them again, more insistently this time. This offer expires today. I'm trying to help you keep your home. 5 acres of unused land seems a small price to pay. Sarah studied the man across from her, his expensive watch, tailored clothing, the confident posture of someone accustomed to getting his way. Then she looked at Sheriff Davis, whose discomfort had progressed to visible anxiety, a thin sheen of sweat now visible on his forehead despite the cool autumn temperature. I'd like my lawyer to review this before I sign anything, she said, finally, making no move to touch the document. Wilson collected the paper with barely concealed annoyance, sliding it back into his portfolio with precise movements that suggested controlled anger. Of course, legal counsel is your right. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. But I should mention that the county council votes tomorrow on accelerated foreclosure proceedings for tax-delinquent properties. Once that process begins, even I won't be able to offer alternatives. The threat hung in the air between them, unambiguous despite its careful phrasing. As they moved toward the door, Wilson paused in the living room, his gaze sweeping across the family photographs, the well-worn furniture, the small treasures accumulated over decades of marriage. His attention lingered briefly on Jim's reading corner, where agricultural journals and local histories still sat in neat stacks beside his favorite armchair. I understand Jim had quite a collection of old farm records and documents, Wilson remarked with practiced casualness. Historical. Materials like that really belong in the county archives where they can be properly preserved. If you come across anything of that nature while packing, my office would be happy to take them off your hands. The statement confirmed Sarah's suspicions like a neon sign. Wilson wasn't just after her land. He was looking for whatever evidence Jim might have gathered before his death. I'll keep that in mind, she said non-committally, holding the door open in a clear gesture of dismissal. After they left, Sarah watched through the window as Wilson appeared to argue with the sheriff beside their vehicles, his gestures becoming increasingly animated while Davis maintained a rigid posture, arms folded defensively across his chest. Whatever the sheriff was saying, or refusing to say, was clearly not what Wilson wanted to hear. Finally, both men entered their separate vehicles and drove away, Wilson's SUV accelerating with unnecessary force that sent gravel spraying from beneath its tires. Sarah waited until they were out of sight before retrieving the documents from the kitchen drawer, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of anger and vindication. Wilson's visit had confirmed everything. This wasn't about back taxes. It was about the gas deposits and altered property records. But who could she trust with this information? The sheriff was clearly uncomfortable, but following Wilson's lead. The county offices were apparently compromised. As Sarah considered her options, her cell phone rang, a local number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Miller, this is Bill Thompson," said a man's voice when she answered. "I was your husband's friend at the county surveyor's office. We need to talk, but not over the phone, and not at your farm. They're watching it." Sarah's suspicion immediately heightened. "How do I know you really knew Jim?" "He helped me rebuild my '67 Chevy the summer before last," Thompson replied. Without hesitation, blue with white racing stripes. "We argued for 2 weeks about whether to modify the original carburetor or stay authentic. Jim won. He always did when it came to classics." The detailed response matched what Sarah knew. Jim had indeed spent weeks in someone's garage that summer, coming home with grease-stained hands and animated stories about carburetor adjustments that she'd pretended to find fascinating. "And he showed me what he found in the original survey maps," Thompson continued, his voice lowering. "The real ones that disappeared from county records last year." Sarah's breath caught. That aligned with Jim's notes about missing records. "Where can we meet?" "Ellie's Diner in Oak Ridge, the next county over. 1 hour," Thompson said urgently. "Bring what Jim left for you. I know he was planning to secure evidence somewhere at the farm." After ending the call, Sarah moved with renewed purpose. She gathered all the materials from the lockbox, along with Jim's ledger, and placed them in a waterproof messenger bag she found in the mudroom. She hesitated, then went to their bedroom and retrieved the small .38 revolver. Jim had insisted she learned to use years ago, just in case, when a series of break-ins had troubled nearby farms. She'd never imagined the case would involve county officials rather than rural thieves. The weight of the gun in her hands brought back memories of Jim patiently teaching her proper stance at the makeshift target range behind the barn, his hands steady on her shoulders as he corrected her aim. "I hope you never need it, Sadie," he'd said, using the nickname reserved for their most intimate moments. "But hope isn't a strategy." Sarah checked that the revolver was loaded, secured it in her purse, and took a final look around the farmhouse. That had been her home for 30 years. Whatever Jim had discovered had likely cost him more than she had initially realized. His heart attack, after an otherwise clean bill of health at his checkup 3 weeks earlier, suddenly seemed suspicious in light of what she now knew. She wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating what and who she was up against. As she backed her 10-year-old Ford pickup down the gravel driveway, Sarah noticed a dark sedan parked on the county road near her property line. It pulled out after she passed, maintaining a discreet distance behind her. Instead of heading directly to Oak Ridge, as she'd told Thompson, she drove to the local grocery store, parked conspicuously near the front doors where several shoppers would witness her arrival, and entered. Inside, she immediately spotted Carol Mason stocking canned goods in aisle 3, her friend of 25 years, whose Thursday shift at Green's Grocery was as reliable as sunrise. Carol looked up in surprise as Sarah approached with unusual urgency. "I need help," Sarah whispered, explaining the situation in hurried fragments while pretending to examine soup labels. "Can you get a message to Michael if I don't call by tonight? Tell him to check Jim's fishing tackle box in the basement. There's a copy of everything there." Carol, whose talent for community gossip had always been matched by her loyalty to friends, nodded without hesitation. "Take my car," she said, pressing keys into Sarah's hand. "It's the blue Subaru at the far end. I'll finish my shift and drive yours home later." After a quick hug of gratitude, Sarah made her way through the store and out the back entrance, where employees took their breaks. She circled around to the far end of the parking lot, keeping delivery trucks between herself and the front entrance, and located Carol's Subaru. As she pulled onto the highway heading toward Oak Ridge, she caught a glimpse of the dark sedan still parked near her truck, its driver apparently unaware of the switch. Ellie's diner was half empty when Sarah arrived, the mid-morning lull creating a quiet atmosphere among the vinyl booths and chrome-edged tables. A bell jingled cheerfully as she entered, several regulars nodding in casual acknowledgement, though none were familiar to her. She chose a seat with a clear view of both the entrance and the parking lot, the document secure in her messenger bag beside her on the bench. A man in his early 60s approached, balding, with a county employee's practical attire and the weathered face of someone who spent time outdoors despite having an indoor profession. "Sarah Miller, Bill Thompson, thank you for coming." Sarah gestured to the seat across from her. "You said you knew what Jim found?" Thompson ordered coffee from a passing waitress before answering, his voice low and measured. "Not everything, but enough. Jim came to me about a year ago with discrepancies he'd found between his original deed and current county records. I helped him access the survey archives, where we discovered it wasn't just your property. The Valley Gas Projects," Sarah said, showing she was informed. Thompson nodded, tension easing slightly from his shoulders. "So he did leave you the evidence. Good. Wilson and his investment group have been systematically altering property records for 3 years, ever since the geological survey showed significant natural gas deposits throughout the valley. But how could they change official records without anyone noticing? Gradually," Thompson explained, adding 2 sugars to his coffee with hands that showed the slight tremor of age. "A small boundary adjustment during a routine title transfer, a correction to digitized records when the county updated its system. Nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms, but cumulatively creating a patchwork of mineral rights across the most valuable deposits." "And the back taxes?" Sarah asked, though she had already guessed the answer. "Fabricated," Thompson confirmed. Grimly, "they created a paper trail of supposed tax deficiencies to force foreclosures on holdout properties. Your farm sits on what their surveys indicate is the richest deposit. Jim refused to sell the back acreage directly, so they waited until after his death to come after me with fake tax bills," Sarah finished, anger building within her. "Exactly. They assumed a widow without farming experience would be easy to intimidate." Thompson paused as the waitress delivered, his coffee resuming only when she was out of earshot. What they didn't count on was Jim documenting everything and finding the original surveys that proved the fraud. Sarah pulled out the USB drive. "He has satellite images showing test drilling, equipment on altered boundaries." Thompson's eyebrows rose. "That's even more than I knew about. With the original deeds and these images, you could file a complaint with the State Attorney General's office." "Why haven't you reported this yourself?" Sarah asked, still cautious, despite his apparent candor. Thompson's expression darkened, lines deepening around his mouth. "I tried 6 months ago. 2 days later, my house was broken into, my computer stolen. The next day, I was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into irregularities in my work." The message was clear. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal a jagged scar running from wrist to elbow. "This wasn't from a fall hiking, like I told everyone." Sarah considered this sobering information. "Do you think Jim's heart attack was really—" "I can't prove anything," Thompson said quietly, stirring his coffee without drinking it. "But Jim was as healthy as a horse, and the timing right after he confronted Wilson about the property flags." He left the implication hanging. As they discussed next steps, Sarah noticed a black sedan pulling into the diner's parking lot, different from the one that had followed her from the farm, but with the same official-looking anonymity that screamed government vehicle. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "They've found us." Thompson glanced out the window and paled visibly. "That's Mark Chambers, Wilson's assistant. We can go out through the kitchen. The cook is my brother-in-law." They slipped through the diner's back exit just as Chambers entered the front, his tall figure visible through the glass door as he scanned the dining area with obvious purpose. Thompson led Sarah to his truck parked behind the building, a dusty Ford F-150 that had seen better days but started immediately when he turned. The key. "Where to now?" Sarah asked, clutching her bag with the documents. "The State Attorney General has a regional office in Capital City, about 2 hours from here," Thompson said, pulling onto a back road rather than the main highway. "I have a contact there who might help us bypass the usual channels, get your evidence directly to investigators." As they drove along rural routes that meandered through farmland and forest, avoiding main arteries where they might be spotted, Sarah examined the contents of Jim's letter to her, which she hadn't had time to read thoroughly before. In it, he detailed his suspicions and discovery of the altered records. But most importantly, he named names, not just Wilson, but 3 county council members, the previous county clerk, and several prominent businessmen in a scheme to acquire mineral rights through fraudulent means. "I've documented everything," Jim had written in a hand more hurried than his usual careful script. "If anything happens to me, take this to someone you trust outside the county. The original deeds and surveys are our proof. I love you, and I'm sorry for keeping this from you, but I needed to be certain before involving you in something potentially dangerous." The letter was dated 2 days before his death. Sarah fought back tears that threatened suddenly, grief mixing with newfound resolve. Jim hadn't been paranoid. He'd uncovered a criminal conspiracy and likely paid for it with his life. Now it was her responsibility to finish what he started, to ensure his death wasn't meaningless. Thompson drove with the steady assurance of someone who knew every back road in 3 counties, occasionally checking his rearview mirror but maintaining a speed that wouldn't attract attention. "Jim was a good man," he said after several miles of silence, "honest to his core. When he found those discrepancies, he could have looked the other way, maybe even negotiated a better price for his land. Plenty would have." "That wasn't Jim," Sarah replied, staring out at passing fields where farmers were preparing for winter, the familiar rhythm of rural life continuing despite the corruption they were fleeing. "He believed in doing things right, even when no one was looking." "Especially when no one was looking," Thompson corrected with a sad smile. "That's why they couldn't buy him off." At the Attorney General's office in Capital City, Thompson's contact, a senior investigator named Martinez, listened to their story with increasing concern, carefully examining the documents, particularly the comparison between original deeds and altered county records. "This is compelling evidence of record tampering," Martinez confirmed after reviewing everything, his experienced eyes narrowing at certain details that seemed to particularly trouble him. "Combined with the suspicious tax assessments and the timing of enforcement actions, we have grounds for a formal investigation." "How long will that take?" Sarah asked, acutely aware that her 30-day foreclosure clock was still ticking. "Normally, weeks," Martinez admitted, his tone professional, but sympathetic. "But these satellite images showing drilling equipment on contested boundaries accelerate things considerably. That's potential environmental violations on top of fraud." Martinez made several calls, speaking in the careful language of law enforcement, his tone shifting from professional inquiry to urgent command as the conversations progressed. Sarah and Thompson waited in the sparse interview room, its institutional beige walls and uncomfortable metal chairs, a stark contrast to the homey warmth of Ellie's diner they'd fled hours earlier. "I've been authorized to assemble a task force immediately," Martinez announced upon returning, rolling up his sleeves with purposeful energy. "The evidence you've provided justifies emergency action to preserve additional records before they can be altered or destroyed." "What about my farm?" Sarah pressed, leaning forward. The foreclosure deadline. We'll seek an emergency injunction, halting all foreclosure proceedings on properties with boundary discrepancies pending our investigation, Martinez assured her, making a note on his yellow legal pad. The judge, I'm submitting this to has a strong record on property rights cases. I'm confident we'll get approval by morning. And Wilson? Thompson asked, the name carrying visible weight as it left his lips. We'll need to move carefully there, Martinez cautioned. These allegations implicate elected officials, which requires additional protocols. But, he added, seeing their expressions fall, given the documentary evidence and potential environmental violations, we can expedite certain aspects, particularly since the most recent satellite images show active drilling on contested boundaries, which creates an immediate public safety concern. Sarah thought of the farm that had been her home for 30 years, of Jim's careful stewardship of the land, of the future they'd planned together that had been cut short. The possibility of justice seemed both tantalizingly close and frustratingly distant. That farm is all I have left of Jim, she said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. I won't be driven from it by criminals, no matter what titles they hold. Martinez studied her with new respect, recognizing the determination that had brought her this far despite intimidation and danger. Then let's make sure you have protection when you return. I can arrange for state police surveillance until this breaks open. 3 days later, Sarah sat at her kitchen table across from Commissioner Wilson and his attorney, a sharp-featured man named Lawrence Gaines, whose reputation for aggressive tactics preceded him throughout the region. Also present was Sheriff Davis, looking distinctly uncomfortable, and a deputy Sarah didn't recognize, who stood by the door with practiced neutrality. The autumn sun streamed through windows Jim had replaced himself 10 years earlier, highlighting dust motes that danced in the air between the adversaries at the table. Outside, the rural silence was broken only by the occasional call of birds preparing for winter and the distant rumble of a tractor working the Henderson farm to the east. I appreciate you reconsidering our offer, Mrs. Miller, Wilson said smoothly, his confidence apparently undiminished by her previous rejection. He slid the same document across the table that he had presented earlier, his manicured nails tapping once on the official county letterhead. As I mentioned, signing over the northwestern parcel resolves all tax obligations and allows you to keep the main farmhouse and agricultural areas, a clean solution for everyone. Sarah noticed he wore a different expensive watch today, platinum rather than gold, subtly showcasing the wealth he'd accumulated on a public servant's salary. His cologne, too costly for the setting, competed with the homey scent of apple pie she'd deliberately baked that morning, knowing comfort foods might unnerve him more than confrontation. I just have one question before I sign, Sarah said calmly, her hands folded on the table in perfectly feigned submission. Does this agreement cover the original property boundaries from my 1987 deed, or the modified boundaries created when county records were altered 3 years ago? The question landed like a stone dropped in still water. Wilson's practiced smile faltered momentarily, his eyes flicking almost imperceptibly toward his attorney. I'm not sure what you mean. The county records reflect the current legal boundaries. That's interesting, Sarah continued, maintaining her composure despite her racing heart, because I have the original survey maps and deed showing my property extends 400 yards further northwest than your current records indicate, precisely where Greenfield Development Partners has been conducting unauthorized drilling tests. The color drained from Wilson's face so completely that for a moment Sarah worried he might faint at her kitchen table. His attorney leaned over to whisper something urgent, but Wilson silenced him with a sharp gesture that revealed cracks in his polished facade. Mrs. Miller, making accusations about record discrepancies is a serious matter, he said, his voice hardening as he struggled to regain control of the conversation. Especially when you're facing imminent foreclosure, the county's documentation stands as the legal record. About that foreclosure, Sarah reached into a drawer and produced a court document that had arrived by courier that morning. This arrived today. An emergency injunction halting all foreclosure proceedings on my property pending investigation by the State Attorney General's office. Wilson snatched the paper, scanning it with increasing alarm, his fingers tightening until the document crinkled at the edges. "This is a misunderstanding that will be resolved quickly," he said, but his confidence had visibly faltered, replaced by a calculation Sarah could almost see working behind his eyes. "I don't think so," Sarah replied, rising from her table and walking to the locked cabinet above her refrigerator. She felt steady now, certain in a way she hadn't since Jim's death. "You see, Jim wasn't just a farmer. Before we married, he worked for the State Land Management Office. He knew exactly how property records should be maintained and archived." She unlocked the cabinet with a small key she wore on a chain around her neck and removed a small fireproof safe that had belonged to Jim's father. When he noticed survey flags in the wrong places, he didn't just check our deed. He pulled the original county survey maps from the state archives, copies that can't be altered like your digital records. Wilson's attorney was now urgently whispering in his ear, his hand gripping his client's forearm with unusual force, but the commissioner seemed frozen in place, his gaze fixed on the safe as if it might contain something far more dangerous than documents. "Mrs. Miller, whatever your husband may have told you," he began, but Sarah cut him off with a confidence she hadn't known she possessed until this moment. "Jim didn't just tell me," she said, entering the combination to the safe with deliberate precision. "He showed me, and he made sure evidence was preserved in multiple locations." She opened the safe, and everyone at the table fell silent as she removed its contents. A sealed evidence packet with the State Attorney General's office stamp clearly visible, receipt dates from 6 months earlier, and a complete duplicate set of all the documents she had already provided to investigator Martinez. "Jim sent these to the state authorities before confronting you," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He suspected you might come after the farm if anything happened to him. The investigation was already underway before you ever brought me that fake tax bill." As if on cue, vehicles could be heard pulling into the driveway, the distinct sound of car doors opening and closing in synchronized precision. Through the kitchen window, Sarah could see state police cars and an unmarked sedan she recognized as Martinez's. "That would be the State Financial Crimes Unit with warrants for county records," she informed them, unable to completely suppress the satisfaction in her voice. "And I believe they have some questions about unusual drilling permits and mysteriously disappearing property boundaries." Sheriff Davis stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "Commissioner, I think we should step outside and speak with these officers." His hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, though whether from habit or precaution wasn't clear. Wilson remained seated, staring at the evidence packet as if it were a snake that might strike. The confident public official had vanished, replaced by a man seeing years of careful planning collapse in minutes. His attorney had already begun packing his briefcase, the practiced moves of someone experienced at swift departures from deteriorating situations. "My husband believed in this land," Sarah said quietly, the room suddenly still despite the increasing activity outside. "Not just our farm, but the entire valley. He believed some things are worth more than money or power. He protected what mattered to him until his last day. I'm just finishing what he started." When state investigators entered the kitchen moments later, led by Martinez in a bulletproof vest, despite his suit, they found Commissioner Wilson still sitting there, silent and defeated, before the evidence that a simple farmer had meticulously gathered and a determined widow had brought to light. Robert Wilson, Mark Chambers, and Lawrence Gaines, Martinez announced formally. I have warrants for your arrest on charges of fraud, tampering with public records, conspiracy, and conversion of property under false pretenses. He nodded to the officers behind him, who moved forward with handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Statements taken at the kitchen table where countless family dinners had once been. Shared, evidence catalogued and removed in official containers. Phone calls to neighbors warning of the unusual activity at the Miller farm. Sarah answered questions until her voice grew hoarse, signed statements until her hand cramped, and pointed investigators toward other properties affected by the altered boundaries. By evening, the official vehicles had departed, leaving only Martinez's unmarked car in the driveway and a state police cruiser parked discreetly at the end of the lane as promised protection. The house felt both emptier and somehow cleaner, as if a long festering wound had finally been lanced. The investigation is just beginning, Martinez cautioned, as they sat drinking tea at the kitchen table, the formal interview complete, but his obvious concern keeping him from departing immediately. Wilson has connections, money, influence. This won't be simple or quick. Nothing worthwhile ever is, Sarah replied, remembering Jim's patience with difficult harvests, his willingness to replant after floods or wait out droughts. The truth is like the seasons. It might take time, but it always comes around eventually. Martinez smiled at the farmer's wisdom. We'll need you to testify when this goes to trial. It could be unpleasant. Defense attorneys can be aggressive, especially with cases involving elected officials. I buried my husband 6 months ago, Sarah said simply. There's nothing a lawyer can say that would hurt more than that. After, Martinez left, promising to return the next day with additional investigators. Sarah walked the perimeter of her property in the gathering twilight. The familiar landscape, the ancient oak where Jim had built a swing for their children, the pond where they'd taught their grandchildren to fish, the apple orchard they'd planted on their 10th anniversary. All of it seemed different now, imbued with new meaning. This land wasn't just soil and trees and buildings. It was a testament to integrity, to standing firm when others would compromise. Jim had given his life protecting it, not just for their family, but for the entire community, whose heritage was being systematically erased through fraud and manipulation. As darkness settled over Pine Creek Farm, Sarah sat on the porch swing, listening to the familiar evening sounds. Crickets beginning their night songs, distant owls calling from the woods beyond the north field, the gentle creaking of the old house settling. For the first time since Jim's death, the aching emptiness beside her felt different. Not gone, never gone, but transformed into something that gave her strength rather than draining it away. We did it, Jim, she whispered to the stars emerging above. They didn't win. 6 months later, Sarah stood on her porch, watching spring return to Pine Creek Farm, the season of renewal, bringing literal and metaphorical rebirth to the land Jim had loved. The apple trees they had planted 20 years earlier were in full bloom, their white flowers stark against the blue sky, promising a bountiful harvest in the fall. The state's investigation had revealed exactly what Jim suspected: a coordinated scheme to manipulate property records throughout the valley, creating fraudulent mineral rights worth millions. Wilson and 4 other county officials now faced federal charges, along with executives from Greenfield Development Partners whose connections reached as far as the state capital. Most satisfying was the restoration of original property boundaries to all affected landowners, many of whom had been fighting their own battles against mysterious tax bills and foreclosure threats. The northwestern ridge of Pine Creek Farm was officially recognized again as Miller property, its boundaries marked with new surveyor stakes that matched the original deed exactly. As Sarah sipped her morning coffee, a familiar vehicle pulled into her driveway. Her son Michael's SUV, loaded with his family visiting from Chicago for the week. Since the case had made regional headlines, both her children had become regular visitors, helping with the farm and reconnecting with the land they'd grown up on. "Mom," Michael called, embracing her as his children raced toward the barn where newborn lambs had arrived the previous week. "How's our whistleblower doing today?" Sarah smiled, watching her grandchildren's excitement. "Just a farmer, protecting what matters." Later that afternoon, as the family gathered around the same kitchen table where she had confronted Wilson months earlier, Sarah shared stories about their father, not just his final act of courage in exposing corruption, but the 30 years of quiet integrity that had preceded it. "Your dad always said this land wasn't just ours to use," she told her grandchildren as they devoured homemade apple pie, the recipe passed down through 4 generations of Miller women. "It was ours to protect for the future, for you." Beyond the kitchen window, Pine Creek Farm stretched toward the hills, the disputed northwestern boundary now securely marked with fresh fencing. Jim's legacy hadn't just saved their home, it had preserved a piece of the valley's history and future for generations to come. Some inheritance, Sarah reflected, watching her family around the table, was measured not in acres or dollars, but in the courage to stand against injustice, even when standing alone. That was Jim's true gift to her, and one she had finally been able to pass along. When the County Historical Society later placed a commemorative plaque honoring landowners who had preserved the valley's agricultural heritage, Jim Miller's name was listed first. The farmer whose careful record-keeping and hidden safe had exposed corruption and protected not just his own legacy, but an entire community's future. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Miller farm as Sarah walked the property line, checking fence posts and examining the new growth that spring had brought. At 63, she moved more slowly than she once had, but with a deliberate purpose that matched the steady rhythm of the seasons. Nearly a year had passed since she had opened Jim's hidden safe and unleashed the truth it contained. The subsequent months had brought changes no one could have anticipated. Wilson and his associates awaited trial, released on substantial bail, but stripped of their positions. The drilling equipment had been removed from contested lands, the exploratory wells kept pending environmental review. Most significantly, the state legislature had passed what locals called the Miller Act, requiring independent verification of all property boundary adjustments and digital archiving of original documents to prevent similar fraud. It wasn't a perfect solution. Corruption always found new avenues, but it was a start, a recognition that what had happened in Greenfield Valley shouldn't be repeated elsewhere. Sarah paused at the crest of the northwestern ridge, the section of land that had nearly been stolen from her. From this vantage point, she could see the entire valley spread before her, a patchwork of farms, woodlots, and small homesteads that had been cultivated by generations of families. In the distance, Capital City's skyline shimmered in the morning. Haze, a reminder that the rural and urban worlds were inexorably connected, each dependent on the other's honesty and good stewardship. A blue jay called sharply from a nearby oak, drawing Sarah's attention to movement along the county road. Bill Thompson's truck appeared, turning onto her driveway with a cloud of dust behind it. Since the investigation broke open, he had been reinstated at the county surveyor's office with back pay and a formal apology, his irregularities revealed as attempts to prevent the very fraud he had been accused of committing. "Morning, Sarah," he called, climbing stiffly from the cab. "Thought you might want to see this before it hits the papers." He handed her a folded document from an official envelope. It was a geological survey report, stamped with state and federal seals. Sarah scanned the technical language until she reached the conclusion section. Natural gas deposits previously identified in Greenfield Valley areas GV7 through GV12 appear to be significantly less viable than initial private surveys indicated. Extraction costs would exceed potential yield by approximately 38%, making commercial development economically untenable under current market conditions. Sarah looked up from the report, momentarily speechless. Thompson grinned, the expression transforming his weathered face. All that corruption, all those manipulated records, all that risk for gas deposits that aren't even commercially viable. Their own survey was flawed. They were willing to destroy a community for profits that would never materialize. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Jim had died, landowners had been threatened, county officials had committed felonies, all for an illusion of wealth that didn't exist. The human cost of greed was incalculable, but ultimately the land itself had had the final word. Jim would have appreciated that, she said finally, folding the report and returning it to Thompson. He always said the land knows more than we do, if we just listen. Thompson nodded, understanding the farmer's philosophy. The preliminary hearing is next week. Prosecutor says you should be prepared for some aggressive questioning. Wilson's lawyers are already trying to paint this as a simple misunderstanding about outdated survey methods. Let them try, Sarah replied with quiet confidence. The truth doesn't need elaborate explanations. As Thompson departed, Sarah remained on the ridge, thinking about the cycles of corruption and redemption, loss and renewal that seemed as natural as the seasons themselves. Jim had understood something fundamental about the land they farmed, that it existed beyond human timescales, beyond human greed, beyond even human stewardship. Their role was temporary, a brief guardianship that could be conducted with integrity or selfishness. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, Emily calling from Denver to confirm her visit the following weekend. Life continued its forward motion, daughters and sons returning to their roots, grandchildren creating new memories on land that had nearly been lost. Sarah smiled as she answered, turning to walk back toward the farmhouse, where so much had happened and so much remained to be done. The truth about Pine Creek Farm had been buried beneath false records and corrupt dealings, but like the seeds Jim had faithfully planted each spring, it had found its way to the light eventually. Some secrets, she reflected, were meant to be revealed, and some were worth protecting with your life. The state courthouse was imposing by local standards, a 3-story brick edifice with white columns and broad stone steps leading to heavy oak doors. Sarah had driven past it hundreds of times over the decades, but had never had reason to enter until today. She adjusted her best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, purchased years ago for a cousin's wedding, and checked her appearance. In the small mirror Emily had insisted she carry. At 63, Sarah's face showed the lines of a life lived outdoors. Her hands bore the calluses of farm work, and her silver hair was styled in simple practicality rather than fashion. But today, those markers of her rural life felt like badges of honor rather than shortcomings against the sophisticated legal professionals surrounding her. Mrs. Miller, Martinez greeted her in the courthouse lobby, his formal suit a sharp contrast to the casual attire he'd worn during farm visits over the past months. The grand jury is ready for your testimony. Just remember what we discussed. Stick to the facts as you know them. Answer directly, and don't let defense counsel rattle you. Sarah nodded, clutching her handbag where she carried copies of Jim's key documents, though the originals were already entered as evidence. I'm ready. The grand jury room was smaller than she'd imagined from television courtroom dramas. Intimate, almost, with 23 citizens seated in simple chairs arranged in a semicircle. These were her peers in the truest sense: teachers, mechanics, store clerks, retirees, a cross-section of the community whose properties might have been next on Wilson's target list had Jim not exposed the scheme. As Sarah was sworn in, she caught sight of Wilson and his attorney in the corner, their presence allowed during this portion of the proceedings. The former commissioner had lost weight since his arrest, his expensive suit now hanging loosely on his frame, dark circles beneath eyes that avoided meeting hers directly. For the next 3 hours, Sarah answered questions from the state prosecutor, describing in methodical detail how she had discovered Jim's records, the confrontation with Wilson, the evidence of altered boundaries, and the fabricated tax bills designed to force foreclosure. She explained Jim's background in land management, his careful documentation methods, and the progressive pattern of property record alterations throughout the valley. When Wilson's attorney cross-examined her, attempting to characterize Jim as a disgruntled farmer with personal animosity toward development, Sarah remained calm, referring repeatedly to the documented evidence rather than emotional appeals. "Mrs. Miller," the defense attorney pressed, his tone suggesting reasonable doubt, "isn't it possible your husband simply misunderstood modern digital record-keeping protocols? After all, he was from a different generation of paper documentation." "My husband managed our farm finances using Excel spreadsheets and digital banking," Sarah replied evenly. "He wasn't confused by technology. He was concerned by records that didn't match their original versions, property boundaries that moved without owner notification, and drilling equipment appearing on land we still legally owned." By the time she was excused, Sarah could read in the grand jurors' expressions that they understood what had happened, not a technical misunderstanding or procedural error, but a deliberate conspiracy to defraud landowners for financial gain. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited on the steps, alerted to the high-profile testimony. Sarah had avoided media attention throughout the investigation, but Martinez had suggested that a brief statement might help counter the narrative Wilson's supporters were promoting about overzealous prosecution of technical violations. "Mrs. Miller, can you tell us why you pursued this case?" called a young reporter from the regional news network, thrusting a microphone toward her. Sarah paused, considering her words carefully. "This isn't about politics or progress or even property," she said finally. "It's about truth. My husband believed that records and boundaries exist for a reason, to protect everyone's rights, not just those with power or money. I'm here because he can't be." "Are you concerned about retaliation from Commissioner Wilson's supporters?" another reporter asked. "I've already lost what mattered most to me," Sarah replied with simple dignity. "Everything else is just details." As cameras flashed and more questions were called out, Thompson appeared at her elbow, gently guiding her toward the parking lot where Michael waited in his car. The media attention was uncomfortable but necessary, a public record of truth, to counter years of concealed deception. 2 weeks later, the grand jury returned indictments against Wilson, 2 other county officials, and 4 executives from Greenfield Development Partners on multiple felony counts. The case would proceed to trial, though Martinez warned it might be a year or more before final resolution, given the complexity and political sensitivity. Sarah returned to Pine Creek Farm with a sense of partial closure. Jim's death had not been officially linked to his discoveries. The medical examiner maintained it was a natural heart attack despite the suspicious timing, but the corruption he had uncovered was now being addressed through proper legal channels. As summer ripened toward harvest, Sarah continued the seasonal work of the farm with help from neighbors, her children during visits, and occasionally Thompson, whose knowledge of property boundaries had expanded to include basic farming skills. The land responded as it always had, indifferent to human drama, yielding according to the care invested and the vagaries of weather. On the anniversary of Jim's death, Sarah visited his grave with fresh flowers from their garden. The small rural cemetery was peaceful in the morning light, generations of area families resting beneath modest markers and flourishing maple trees. The preliminary hearing went well, she told him, arranging daisies and black-eyed Susans in the simple vase. Wilson's lawyers tried to get it dismissed, but the judge allowed all the evidence. His face when they showed the original deed side by side with the altered records, I wish you could have seen it. A gentle breeze rustled the maple leaves overhead, creating patterns of light and shadow across the grave marker. Michael's talking about moving back next year, Sarah continued. Emily too, maybe. They're thinking about running the farm together after I retire. Can you believe it? The kids who couldn't wait to leave for the big city, coming home to continue what we started. She traced Jim's name on the granite marker, the solidity of the stone somehow comforting beneath her fingers. I found your anniversary card, she said more softly. The one you hid in your desk drawer for our 31st. I know you suspected something might happen to you. I know you were trying to protect me by not telling me everything. But I need you to know I would have stood with you from the beginning if you'd let me. The cemetery remained silent, except for birdsong and distant wind in the trees. I'm standing now, Sarah finished, rising from the small bench beside the grave. And I won't stop until it's finished. Udidi. As she walked back to her truck, Sarah noticed an unfamiliar car parked near the cemetery entrance, its driver quickly averting his gaze when she looked in that direction. The investigation had made her more observant, more suspicious of unusual occurrences. She made a mental note to mention it to Martinez during their weekly check-in call. The battle for Pine Creek Farm and for the truth Jim had died protecting wasn't over yet. But Sarah Miller had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed, a determination that matched the stubborn persistence of the land itself. Like the fields they had cultivated together, she would endure, season after season, until justice took root and flourished. Some battles were fought with legal briefs and courtroom testimonies rather than plows and seed drills, but the principles remained the same. Prepare the ground thoroughly, plant with care, tend vigilantly, and trust that truth, given proper conditions, would eventually yield its harvest. 18 months after Sarah had first discovered Jim's hidden lockbox, the trial of Robert Wilson and his co-conspirators finally began. The intervening period had brought changes both to Pine Creek Farm and to Sarah herself. The initial media sensation had gradually subsided, replaced by the slow, methodical grind of the legal system. Motions and counter-motions, evidence hearings, jury selection, all had stretched the process far beyond what she had initially anticipated. Sarah had used the time to rebuild, not just the farm's operations, but her own understanding of the property she had shared with Jim for 3 decades. With Thompson's help, she had walked every boundary line, comparing the original survey markers with current positions, documenting each discrepancy for the prosecution. The northwestern ridge that had nearly been stolen from her had become her favorite spot for evening reflection, its elevation offering views across the valley that helped clarify her thoughts. The criminal courtroom was considerably larger than the grand jury room had been, its high ceilings and formal architecture designed to impress upon all who entered the seriousness of judicial proceedings. Sarah sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, dressed in a charcoal gray suit Emily had insisted on buying her for the occasion. You represent more than just yourself now, Mom, her daughter had explained while making alterations to the hem. You're standing for everyone whose land was threatened. Beside her sat Michael and his wife, Jennifer, who had taken unpaid leave from their jobs in Chicago to attend the trial's opening weeks. On her other side was Bill Thompson, whose testimony would follow hers in establishing the pattern of record, manipulation. The prosecution had strategically scheduled Sarah as their second witness, following a forensic accountant who would establish the financial connections between Wilson, the other county officials, and Greenfield development partners. The defendants sat at their table across the aisle. Wilson, former Deputy Commissioner Hargrove, County Clerk Patricia Moffett, and 3 executives from Greenfield. Their collective legal representation formed an imposing wall of expensive suits and leather briefcases, 7 attorneys for 6 defendants, a visual reminder of the resources being marshaled against the prosecution's case. Judge Eleanor Blackburn entered, her reputation for impartiality and thorough legal knowledge, having survived multiple defense attempts to have her removed from the case on various technical grounds. "All rise!" called the bailiff, and Sarah felt a momentary dizziness at the reality of what was finally happening. The system that Wilson had manipulated for years was now being turned toward justice, its machinery slow but relentless. The morning proceeded with opening statements, the prosecution methodically outlining the conspiracy they would prove beyond reasonable doubt. The systematic alteration of property records over a 3-year period, the fraudulent tax assessments, the unauthorized drilling on contested lands, and the financial benefits that flowed to all defendants through various disguised channels. "This case is fundamentally about public trust," concluded State Prosecutor Rebecca Halliday, her measured tone carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "When officials entrusted with maintaining accurate records deliberately falsify those records for personal gain, they undermine the very foundation of property rights on which our society depends. The evidence will show that these defendants executed a calculated scheme to defraud landowners throughout Greenfield Valley, with devastating consequences for farmers like James Miller, whose meticulous record-keeping posthumously exposed their crimes." The defense openings painted a sharply different picture, characterized by terms like modernization of outdated records, standardization of inconsistent boundary definitions, and good faith errors in digital conversion. Wilson was portrayed as a progressive official bringing technical innovation to rural governance, misunderstood by traditional landowners resistant to change. This case represents a fundamental misunderstanding of modern land management practices, insisted Wilson's lead attorney, Howard Sheffield, whose metropolitan Polish seemed calculated to create distance between the jury and the rural plaintiffs. Commissioner Wilson implemented digital record systems that revealed inconsistencies in property boundaries dating back decades. What the prosecution characterizes as fraud was simply good governance, correcting historical errors and bringing clarity to outdated records. Sarah listened with growing indignation as Sheffield effectively called Jim incompetent rather than criminal. According to this narrative, her husband hadn't uncovered corruption, but had simply failed to understand progress. She felt Michael's hand close over hers, his silent support steadying her as the defense continued its revisionist account. When the forensic accountant took the stand that afternoon, however, the defense's carefully constructed narrative began showing cracks. Financial records told a story that couldn't be easily dismissed as modernization or good faith error. Wire transfers from Greenfield subsidiaries to accounts controlled by Wilson and the other officials timed precisely around key record alterations. Property purchases by shell companies traced back to the defendants, acquiring land adjacent to areas with modified boundaries. Dramatic increases in Wilson's lifestyle expenditures coinciding with the scheme. A vacation home in Colorado, a yacht docked on the coast, private school tuition for grandchildren. By day's end, the jury had been presented with a clear financial motive for the record alterations, establishing the critical why of the prosecution's case. Tomorrow would bring Sarah's testimony, which would provide the how and what the tangible evidence Jim had preserved and she had brought to light. That evening, returning to the hotel where she was staying during the trial, Sarah found an unmarked envelope that had been slid under her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Some battles aren't worth the cost. Your husband learned this too late. Testimony can be forgotten as easily as property lines can be redrawn. Think of your family." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she read the thinly veiled threat. The protective bubble of legal process and media attention had created an illusion of safety, but this anonymous message was a stark reminder that powerful interests remained threatened by what she knew. She called Martinez immediately, who arranged for additional security at the hotel and documented the threat as potential witness intimidation. "This actually helps our case," he assured her after photographing the note and envelope for evidence. "It demonstrates consciousness of guilt. They wouldn't try to silence you if they weren't afraid of what you have to say." "It's not just me I'm worried about," Sarah admitted, thinking of her children who had returned to the spotlight by attending the trial, of her grandchildren whose photographs appeared occasionally in human interest stories about the case. "We'll arrange protection for your family too," Martinez promised. "But the best security is completing your testimony tomorrow. Once your evidence is on the record, intimidating you loses its purpose." Sarah slept poorly that night. Dreams, filled with shifting boundaries and faceless men in suits, measuring her children for coffins. She woke before dawn, made coffee in the small hotel room, and spent the quiet hours reviewing her testimony notes one final time, ensuring that Jim's meticulous work would be presented with equivalent care. The courtroom was more crowded than the previous day, word having spread about the forensic accountant's compelling financial evidence. Sarah spotted several of her neighbors in the public seating, farmers and small business owners from throughout the valley whose properties had been affected by the scheme. Their presence strengthened her resolve as she was called to the witness stand. After being sworn in, Sarah settled into the witness chair, adjusting her posture to address the jury as Martinez had coached her. These 12 citizens, a retired teacher, a mechanic, a nurse, a construction worker among them, would determine whether justice would be served for Jim and the community he had tried to protect. "Mrs. Miller," began Prosecutor Halliday, "could you please tell the court how you first became aware of discrepancies in your property records?" For the next 2 hours, Sarah described the journey from confused widow facing inexplicable tax bills to investigator uncovering systematic fraud. She explained Jim's background in land management, his meticulous documentation practices, and the hidden safe where he had preserved evidence of the altered records. Step by step, she walked the jury through the comparison between original deeds and modified digital records, the satellite images showing unauthorized drilling on contested boundaries, and the pattern of similar alterations affecting multiple properties throughout the valley. The evidence she presented wasn't just about Pine Creek Farm, but about a community's heritage being systematically erased through digital manipulation and bureaucratic deception. Throughout her testimony, she maintained the calm, factual approach Martinez had emphasized, allowing the documents and records to speak for themselves rather than appealing to emotion or speculation. When Sheffield rose for cross-examination, his strategy became immediately apparent: attack Jim's credibility rather than Sarah's. "Mrs. Miller, isn't it true that your husband had previous disputes with Commissioner Wilson over zoning variances for your property?" He began, attempting to establish personal animosity as Jim's motive. "Jim applied for a permit to build an equipment barn in 2017, Sarah replied evenly. The application was initially denied based on outdated wetland designations. He provided corrected survey information and the permit was eventually approved. It was a routine administrative process, not a dispute. Sheffield pivoted seamlessly. And yet, in his private notes, which the prosecution has entered as evidence, your husband referred to Commissioner Wilson as obstructionist and hostile to agricultural interests. Those don't sound like the words of someone engaged in routine administrative processes. Jim was passionate about preserving farmland, Sarah acknowledged. He expressed frustration when he felt agricultural needs weren't being prioritized, but he distinguished between policy disagreements and illegal actions. The altered property records weren't a matter of opinion, they were demonstrable facts. For nearly 3 hours, Sheffield attempted to characterize Jim as a disgruntled farmer with a personal vendetta, to suggest Sarah might have misunderstood technical aspects of modern record-keeping, to imply that boundary discrepancies were common clerical errors rather than deliberate fraud. Each time, Sarah returned to the documented evidence, refusing to be drawn into speculation or emotion. "Mrs. Miller," Sheffield asked in apparent exasperation toward the end of his cross-examination, "if your husband was so certain of wrongdoing, why didn't he take his concerns to the state authorities while he was alive? Why secretly gather evidence rather than seeking immediate resolution?" Sarah paused, considering the question that had haunted her own thoughts during sleepless nights. "He did report his concerns," she replied finally, "to Sheriff Davis, who directed him to Commissioner Wilson, to the county surveyor's office, where Bill Thompson was placed on administrative leave after trying to help him, to the local newspaper, which declined to investigate what they characterized as technical disputes about property lines." She looked directly at Wilson, whose carefully maintained expression of professional concern couldn't quite mask the tension visible in his jaw and hands. Jim discovered that the very authorities responsible for maintaining honest records were involved in falsifying them. So he did what farmers have always done when facing powerful forces beyond their control. He carefully documented everything, preserved the evidence, and trusted that truth would eventually have its day. When she was finally excused from the witness stand, Sarah felt a curious lightness, as if some burden she had carried since finding Jim's hidden safe had been partially lifted. She had fulfilled her promise to him, had ensured his meticulous work would serve its intended purpose. Whatever the jury ultimately decided, she had completed the task Jim had begun. The trial continued for 3 more weeks, with testimony from surveyors, digital records experts, environmental inspectors who had documented the unauthorized drilling sites, and eventually from former county employees who had witnessed or participated in the record alterations. Each witness added layers to the foundation Sarah's testimony had established, creating a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy that had threatened Greenfield Valley's agricultural heritage. Defense attorneys fought vigorously at every stage, challenging evidence, questioning motivations, suggesting alternative explanations for the documented discrepancies. But the cumulative weight of documentation proved difficult to dismiss, particularly when corroborated by multiple independent sources. Most damaging to the defense was the testimony of Patricia Moffett, the former county clerk, who accepted a plea agreement in exchange for her cooperation. With clinical precision, she described the systematic process of altering digital property records at Wilson's direction, the careful selection of properties based on geological survey data, and the coordination with Greenfield development partners to exploit the manipulated boundaries. We specifically targeted farms where the owners were elderly, where succession plans weren't clear, or where financial pressures might make them vulnerable to tax enforcement, Moffett testified, avoiding eye contact with her former colleagues at the defense table. The Millers were initially considered poor candidates because of James Miller's background in land management and his meticulous record-keeping. But after he began asking questions about the boundary discrepancies, Commissioner Wilson became concerned about what he might discover and insisted on accelerating the timeline for their property. On the trial's final day, Sarah sat with her family as the jury filed in after 3 days of deliberation. The courtroom fell silent, tension palpable as the foreman handed the verdict forms to the bailiff. Judge Blackburn reviewed them briefly, her expression giving no indication of their contents, before returning them for the foreman to read. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant, Robert Wilson, guilty. On the count of tampering with public records, we find the defendant, Robert Wilson, guilty. On the count of abuse of public office, we find the defendant, Robert Wilson, guilty. The pattern continued through all defendants and all charges, guilty on every count, the jury having found the evidence overwhelming despite the defense's efforts to characterize the scheme as misunderstanding or clerical error. Wilson's face remained impassive, though Sarah noticed his hands trembling slightly as the verdicts were read. Outside the courthouse, spring sunshine illuminated the historic town square, where media had gathered to report on the case's conclusion. Sarah stood with Michael and Emily flanking her as Martinez addressed the press. Today's verdict sends a clear message that public records are a sacred trust, not tools for personal enrichment, the prosecutor stated. This case would not have been possible without the extraordinary documentation provided by James Miller before his death, and the courage of his widow, Sarah, in bringing that evidence forward despite significant pressure and intimidation. When reporters called for Sarah to comment, she stepped forward with the simple dignity that had characterized her throughout the proceedings. My husband believed that some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. Not just land, but truth, not just property boundaries, but the principles they represent. This verdict honors his belief that ordinary citizens can stand against corruption if they're willing to stand together. As cameras flashed and more questions were called out, Sarah stepped back, declining further comment. The public battle was concluded. Now began the private work of continuing what Jim had started, preserving Pine Creek Farm for future generations who would understand its true value. 2 months later, Judge Blackburn delivered the sentences. 12 years for Wilson, 8 to 10 for the other defendants, along with financial penalties that would eventually help fund a county-wide program to digitize and secure historical property records against future manipulation. The punishments seemed simultaneously severe and insufficient. No prison term could fully address the damage done to community trust or compensate for Jim's loss. Summer settled over Pine Creek Farm with familiar rhythm, crops growing, livestock grazing, the perpetual maintenance of buildings and equipment that farming required. But beneath these timeless patterns, significant changes were taking place. Michael had resigned from his accounting position in Chicago and moved his family into the old tenant house at the farm's eastern edge, apprenticing himself to the agricultural life he had once been eager to escape. Emily visited monthly from Denver, her veterinary expertise a valuable addition to the farm's operations as she considered her own potential return. On the anniversary of the trial's conclusion, Sarah received a letter from Judge Blackburn, not an official communication, but a personal note. Mrs. Miller, I've presided over hundreds of cases in my judicial career, but few have affected me as deeply as yours. Beyond the legal principles at stake was a more fundamental question about what we value as a society: quick profit or sustainable stewardship, expedient power or enduring truth. Your husband's foresight and your courage have strengthened the legal foundations that protect all property owners from similar schemes. Some verdicts represent technical justice. Yours represented essential justice. Pine Creek Farm stands as testimony that some boundaries should remain precisely where they were drawn. Sarah read the letter twice before carefully adding it to Jim's memorabilia box, where she preserved items that told the story of their life together. Among blueprints for barns never built, pressed flowers from anniversary bouquets, and children's crayon drawings now faded by decades, the judge's letter found its place. Another chapter in the ongoing story of a family's commitment to the land they called home. That evening, Sarah walked to the northwestern ridge as sunset painted the valley in copper and gold. The contested 5 acres that had nearly cost her everything now supported a small orchard planted in Jim's memory, heritage apple varieties that would take years to reach full production. Michael's children had helped plant the saplings, their small hands learning the patient work of creation that farming required. Beyond the ridge, neighboring farms continued their own seasonal cycles, their boundaries now secured by legislation born from Greenfield Valley's ordeal. What had begun as one farmer's discovery of irregularities in his property records had culminated in systemic reforms protecting landowners throughout the state. Sarah settled on the stone bench Michael had built at the orchard's edge, watching twilight deepen across the landscape. Jim had often claimed that farming was an act of faith, in weather that couldn't be controlled, in cycles that couldn't be rushed, in futures that couldn't be guaranteed. His final act of faith had been in Sarah herself, trust that she would continue what he had begun, that she would protect what mattered most when he no longer could. That faith had not been misplaced. Pine Creek Farm remained intact, its boundaries restored to their rightful positions, its operations continuing under family stewardship. The land Jim had loved endured, not just as productive acreage, but as living testimony to principles worth defending. As darkness settled over the valley and the first stars appeared above, Sarah whispered words meant only for the evening breeze and whatever might lie beyond it. "We did it, Jim." The truth stayed buried just long enough. Walking back toward the farmhouse, where windows glowed with warm light and voices of 3 generations mingled in evening conversation, Sarah felt the quiet satisfaction of promises kept and battles concluded. The hidden safe beneath Jim's workshop floor had contained more than documents and deeds. It had held a legacy of integrity that continued to shape the land and the family that tended it. When the County Historical Society later commissioned a book documenting Greenfield Valley's agricultural heritage, they dedicated an entire chapter to what became known locally as the Miller case. Historians noted the parallels to earlier eras when powerful interests had attempted to displace family farms through various means, and the common thread of resistance that had preserved rural communities against such pressures. The concrete evidence, the altered records, the financial transactions, the geological surveys filled archival boxes in the state's judicial storage facility, their legal relevance gradually diminishing as sentences were served and appeals exhausted. But the enduring legacy lived at Pine Creek Farm, where the apple trees on the northwestern ridge grew stronger each season, their roots anchoring deep into soil that remained, after considerable struggle, precisely where it belonged. Some inheritance was measured in acres, Sarah reflected as she watched her grandchildren racing across fields their great-grandfather had first cultivated. Some in buildings, equipment, or financial assets listed in wills and trusts. But Jim's most valuable bequest had been less tangible. The understanding that boundaries matter not because of what they contain, but because of what they represent. The lines demarcating Pine Creek Farm weren't just measurements on paper. They were principles made visible, statements about what deserved protection and what warranted sacrifice. Every season brought reminders of cycles continuing, crops planted and harvested, livestock born and matured, buildings weathered and repaired. Yet beneath these visible patterns lay deeper continuities. truth preserved despite pressure to abandon it, justice achieved despite obstacles erected against it, community sustained despite forces that would fragment it for profit. The safe that had protected Jim's evidence now held new documents: Michael and Emily's formal agreement to maintain the farm's agricultural status in perpetuity, legal structures ensuring Pine Creek would never be subdivided or developed, educational programs allowing local schoolchildren to learn about sustainable farming practices on land preserved for that purpose. Sarah's role had gradually shifted from primary operator to mentor and guide. Her knowledge of the farm's rhythms and requirements shared with the next generation, now assuming daily management. This too was part of farming's ancient pattern, the gradual transfer of not just techniques, but philosophies, not just operations, but obligations. On particularly clear evenings, when sunset painted the valley in the same golden light that had illuminated it for centuries before property lines were drawn or deeds recorded, Sarah sometimes thought she glimpsed in the quality of that timeless illumination something that transcended even the justice she had fought so hard to secure. Some essential rightness in the land itself that predated human claims and would outlast human disputes. In such moments, boundaries seemed both crucially important and ultimately temporary, necessary for justice among people, but humbled by the greater continuities of soil and season, growth and decay, the perpetual renewal that farming both witnessed and participated in. Perhaps that was Jim's deepest wisdom, Sarah reflected, as another growing season began. His recognition that they were temporary stewards of something that would outlast them, caretakers rather than owners, protectors of boundaries that served larger purposes than mere possession. The hidden safe had preserved evidence that changed the course of legal proceedings, restored rightful boundaries, and secured justice against corruption. But its greatest treasure had been the confirmation that some principles were worth protecting at any cost, a truth no fraud could falsify, no threat could diminish, no passage of time could erode. Pine Creek Farm continued, its boundaries intact, its future secured, its story woven into the valley's collective memory. And in the orchard on the northwestern ridge, trees planted in memory yielded fruit for generations, who would never forget how close they came to losing an inheritance more precious than land, the understanding that truth, once buried, needs only faithful tending to find its way eventually into light. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.